When you think of Henry VIII's wives, you probably picture Anne Boleyn losing her head, or poor Catherine Howard dancing toward disaster. But tonight, I want to tell you about the one woman he couldn't even bring himself to touch, the queen he called ugly. Her name was Anne of Cleves, and for centuries, that single insult has been her entire legacy. But what if I told you the story was never about her face? It was about his pride. What if the so-called ugly queen was actually the only one clever enough to survive him? As you lie there, about to drift off while I unpack 500-year-old royal drama for you, the least you could do is hit subscribe. Go on, don't make me beg from 1539. And tell me, what time is it where you are? Because wherever you are, this is your permission to slow down, breathe, and fall asleep to the strangest love story in Tudor history. The story of the woman Henry VIII couldn't love, and the queen who outlived his legend. Anne of Cleves entered the world on a gray September morning in 1515 at Swan Castle near Düsseldorf. The air was cool, heavy with mist from the Rhine, and the bells from the nearby church rang softly across the fields. She was born into comfort, yes, but not glamour. The kind of German nobility that prided itself on good order and punctual bread baking rather than courtly poetry. Her father was Johann the Peaceful, a duke with the soul of an accountant, and her mother, Maria of Jülichberg, ruled with a precision that could frighten even the most stubborn nobleman. Maria didn't just carry a title, she wielded it. If her husband was the peaceful, she was the peace enforcer. In the Duchy of Cleves, life ran on lists, ledgers, and an occasional sermon about moderation. While England and France competed over who could throw the most glittering banquet, the Cleves court measured success in properly stored grain and well-trained horses. Here, royalty didn't play the lute. They did their own taxes. It was less about elegance, more about efficiency, and Anne grew up right in the middle of it, learning early that good governance wasn't loud, it was meticulous. The castle where she spent her childhood wasn't the dreamy kind you'd find in storybooks. It was stone and drafty, with walls so thick they could hold back both winter and emotion. But it had warmth, not the warmth of luxury, but the warmth of repetition. Servants' footsteps before dawn, the smell of bread baking, the steady rhythm of a household that valued reliability above all things. Anne's world was predictable, almost soothingly so. She was the third of 4 children, bookended by a fiery older sister, Sibylla, a practical younger brother, Wilhelm, and a lively little sister, Amalia. Sibylla had opinions about everything, including religion, which was beginning to divide families across Europe. Wilhelm, destined to inherit, was serious, diplomatic, already practicing the art of compromise at age 12. Amalia was the entertainer, sharp-tongued, fond of music, and often caught whispering jokes during Mass. Anne, quiet and observant, was the balance between them all. Her mother insisted that her daughters be useful. They learned sewing, cooking, and estate management, because a noblewoman who could manage a household was far more valuable than one who could merely curtsy attractively. Anne learned how to calculate rents, how to track the delivery of grain, how to negotiate with stewards who thought they knew better. Her English counterparts were being trained to flirt. Anne was being trained to keep the roof from leaking. That practicality shaped her. She didn't grow up dreaming of romance or fine silks. She grew up knowing that people who depended on her expected competence, not charm. It wasn't that she lacked imagination. She simply valued the kind of beauty that lasted beyond a dance. And that, ironically, was exactly what would make her so foreign to Henry VIII's court years later. The culture around her was deeply religious, but quietly tolerant. Her father sympathized with reformers. Her mother remained loyal to Rome. Her brother would one day befriend Protestants, while her sisters debated theology at the dinner table like it was sport. Anne absorbed it all without choosing sides. She learned flexibility before she ever learned politics. The art of smiling without agreeing, of bending without breaking, that became her hidden strength. To picture her as a child is to imagine a girl standing by a window, looking out over fog-draped fields, her hands clasped neatly, her face unreadable but curious. She was tall for her age, with fair hair that caught the light, and a kind of calm presence that made her seem older than she was. She wasn't particularly talkative, not out of shyness, but because she didn't waste words. When she did speak, it was measured, deliberate, as if she'd already considered every possible reaction. People would later mistake this quietness for dullness, but it was really attentiveness. She had learned that silence kept you safe in rooms full of men who loved to hear themselves talk. When she was 11, Anne was betrothed to the Duke of Lorraine's son, a match arranged purely for politics. The engagement was announced with much ceremony and no feeling, and by the time she turned 18, it had quietly fallen apart. She didn't seem disappointed. In fact, she seemed relieved. Home was comfort. Uncertainty was risk. She preferred the familiar rhythms of her mother's world, letters, accounts, and prayers said before candlelight, to the unpredictable noise of diplomacy. There's something admirable about her simplicity. She didn't need to stand out, didn't crave attention or praise. She liked things that made sense: clean linen, a well-fed horse, a quiet evening by the fire. Yet, there was intelligence in her steadiness. She watched people carefully, learned what they wanted, what they feared. It was a subtle education, not in books, but in behavior. And in that, she would one day outwit a king without even meaning to. The world around her, however, was shifting. The old certainties of faith and power were cracking open. Luther was writing, the Pope was fuming, and across the Channel, Henry VIII was inventing entirely new ways to make his marital problems into national crises. Anne knew none of that yet. She was busy riding through misty fields, feeding hounds, learning embroidery patterns, and occasionally sighing over the tedious Latin lessons that everyone swore would make her cultured. She had no reason to think her quiet, orderly life would ever be disturbed. If you were to walk through the castle corridors in those years, you might have found her in the hall overseeing servants, or at the window counting wagons crossing the bridge below, or helping her mother prepare accounts for the next feast. She was observant, methodical, reliable, qualities that in the Tudor world were about as romantic as a sack of flour. But they were also the qualities that would save her. There's a certain irony in history's memory of Anne of Cleves. People call her plain, unimaginative, dull, as though competence were a curse. Yet it's this quiet discipline, this patience she learned in her mother's court, that would one day protect her when all around her other queens were losing their heads, both figuratively and literally. In Cleves, she learned that love was optional, but stability was sacred. She learned to run a household, to manage men twice her age, and to do it without theatrics. She learned that silence often carried more power than speech. She learned to survive rules she didn't write. And so, while the rest of Europe chased reformations and royal pageantry, Anne of Cleves came of age in a world that valued order over passion. It wasn't glamorous, but it was strong. She had no idea yet that this calm, steady upbringing, the thing that made her seem so un-English, would be her greatest armor. In time, that same quiet girl from the middle of the map would be sent across the sea to marry a king who valued spectacle over substance, a man who couldn't bear silence unless it echoed his own voice. But for now, Anne is still home, the firelight flickering across her face, her mother's voice drifting through the corridors, her world perfectly measured. She doesn't yet know that her fate will depend on the same skills she's mastering now: listening, yielding, and surviving the impossible demands of powerful men. She will be remembered for the things she wasn't: not beautiful enough, not lively enough, not English enough. But here, in this quiet court between worlds, she is already becoming what she truly was: the calm in the storm of Henry's chaos. Anne of Cleves learned early how to endure, how to bend without breaking. And when history finally tests her, that quiet endurance will become her crown. You can picture it, can't you? A narrow room in a German castle, mid-autumn light pouring through tall windows, dust drifting in gold streaks across the air. At the far end of the room sits Anne of Cleves, 23 years old, perfectly still. She's not a woman who fidgets. She's been told to sit like this for hours, while a man she's just met studies her face with unsettling precision. That man is Hans Holbein the Younger, portraitist to kings, an artist with a brush as sharp as any diplomat's quill. He's been sent by Henry VIII of England to paint the woman who might, if all goes according to plan, become the king's fourth wife. Holbein isn't here to capture a soul, he's here to complete a transaction. There's an awkward politeness between them. Holbein bows, sets out his pigments, arranges the chair so the light falls gently across Anne's face. She says little. Her German is thick, his is broken, and neither of them wants to start this session by accidentally offending an entire duchy. So they work in silence. Anne is wearing what the court of Cleves considers its finest gown: layers of rich damask and fur, gold threads stitched so finely they glint even in the shadow. Her sleeves are wide, her collar high. To an English eye, it might seem old-fashioned, severe, but this is what dignity looks like where she comes from. Holbein tilts his head. His job is to capture truth, but not too much truth. Henry's court wants a likeness accurate enough for diplomacy, flattering enough for romance, somewhere between realism and advertisement. He studies her hands, broad, elegant, the hands of someone who actually uses them. He notes the quiet poise, the way she looks neither timid nor vain. She is, in every sense, composed. You can almost feel the tension in the room, an artist worrying about how much honesty the king will tolerate, a woman wondering if this painting will change her life for better or worse. The scratch of the brush on canvas, the faint smell of linseed oil, the soft rustle of silk when she breathes. Imagine that. Your entire romantic future decided by a headshot. Holbein, in this moment, is basically the 16th century version of a dating app filter, commissioned to make you look queen material without crossing into false advertising. No pressure. He paints quickly but carefully, capturing the oval of her face, the steady eyes, the subtle turn of her mouth. Not quite a smile. Anne doesn't really do smiles, but not a frown either. It's the expression of someone who understands that history rarely rewards women who look too pleased. When he finishes, he adds the final touches: the embroidery, the faint blush of her lips, the curve of light on her cheek. The result is balanced, honest, serene, maybe even warm in a restrained sort of way. There's no passion in it, but there's strength. A sensible king, you'd think, could appreciate that. Holbein packs up the painting and leaves Cleves. Anne curtsies politely, grateful that she can finally move her neck again. She doesn't imagine the painting will change anything. To her, it's just another tedious diplomatic ritual. But hundreds of miles away, in England, a restless, aging king is about to fall in love, not with Anne of Cleves, but with the idea of her. Henry VIII receives Holbein's portrait like a man unwrapping a sacred relic. The painting is carried into his private chambers, set against the wall, unveiled with ceremony. He studies it for a long time. To him, she looks gentle, modest, obedient, all the things his last two wives decidedly weren't. And yes, she looks pretty enough. Not dazzling like Anne Boleyn, not demure like Jane Seymour, but neat, polished, symmetrical, the kind of face you could imagine on coins. Henry sighs, loudly, dramatically, as though someone's watching. At last, he probably thinks, a woman who won't argue. That, of course, is where everything goes wrong. Holbein's painting was never meant to seduce. It was meant to inform. He paints what he sees. A capable young woman in respectable fashion, her eyes calm, her mouth thoughtful. But Henry, ever the romantic when it suited him, fills in the blanks with fantasy. He imagines a softness in her voice, a warmth in her manner, perhaps even a willingness to adore him despite the ulcer on his leg and the national debt. You could say he fell for his own imagination. Or you could say that for once, Holbein painted the truth and the king just refused to believe it. When the portrait reaches Cleves, it's considered a triumph. Henry sends gifts, letters, promises of alliance. The Duke of Cleves beams with satisfaction. Finally, a royal marriage that might anchor them in English favor. Anne, as always, says very little. She agrees gracefully to become Henry's bride. She doesn't blush, she doesn't swoon, she simply nods. Duty is duty. You can almost hear her mother reminding her, a queen's worth is measured in peace, not passion. If only Henry had been taught the same lesson. Let's pause a moment and think about how absurd this all is. Entire kingdoms, treaties, and the future of the Reformation hinge on a portrait. One man's interpretation of another woman's face. Imagine falling in love with someone's picture, crossing oceans to meet them, and then realizing the painter forgot to mention a few details, like how humans look in motion, or how they behave when you surprise kiss them in a hallway. Be honest, you've probably had a smaller version of this. You've seen a picture online, thought, they look perfect, and then met them in person, only to wish you could file a diplomatic complaint. Henry did exactly that, except with more embroidery and consequences. Still, for now, everything looks perfect on parchment. England gains a Protestant ally, Cleves gains prestige, and Henry convinces himself that he's finally made a sensible choice. A mature, stable match. No scandal, no arguments, no beheadings. Meanwhile, Anne begins her slow journey toward England. She knows little about her new husband beyond his titles and his age. She's never seen his face. She doesn't speak his language. All she has is the painting, a copy sent back to Cleves as proof that she's been approved. She studies it occasionally. Perhaps she wonders what he really looks like. Perhaps she doesn't. Because the truth is, Anne isn't looking for love. She's looking for safety, and that difference will soon make her seem alien to the English court, which thrives on spectacle. Holbein, by the way, survives this ordeal quite comfortably. Whatever people later said about the portrait, too flattering, too plain, too honest, it never costs him his job. The king still commissions him for miniatures, designs, decorations, which tells us something important. Henry didn't hate the painting. He hated reality for failing to match it. So when you look at that portrait today, Anne of Cleves in her red gown, hands folded, eyes steady, you're not seeing a lie. You're seeing a woman perfectly caught between her own world and someone else's expectations. You're seeing the calm before the diplomatic storm. And there's irony in that face, isn't there? Centuries later, people still call her the ugly one. But Holbein never painted ugliness. He painted balance, dignity, a quiet confidence that didn't rely on charm, the same composure that would one day save her life when beauty couldn't save anyone else's. Henry saw the picture and thought he'd found peace. What he'd actually found was someone who couldn't and wouldn't play the role he'd written for her. And that's where the myth begins. The myth of the woman too plain for a king who had long since stopped being handsome himself. Anne of Cleves didn't smile for Holbein because she didn't need to. She'd been raised to be steady, not seductive. The English wanted warmth. She offered calm. They wanted poetry. She spoke in practical terms. She was, from the very start, a queen out of place, painted in stillness, chosen for an illusion, and destined to be judged by the gap between the two. So next time you see that portrait, remember, it wasn't a failure of art or beauty. It was a failure of imagination. Henry wanted a fantasy. Holbein gave him a human being. And Anne, somewhere between them, became history's most famous blind date. So if you've just spent the last couple minutes listening to me unpack 16th century dating disasters while your tea went cold, the least you can do is subscribe. It's free. It helps more sleepy history nerds find us. And honestly, after what Anne went through, you can manage one little click. Picture England in 1538. The wind howls through half-built fortifications. Monks' voices have gone silent, and somewhere inside Whitehall Palace sits Henry VIII, sulking. He's not in one of his glorious moods. His leg hurts, his pride hurts, and his diplomatic options. They're bleeding out faster than his patience. Across Europe, two men, Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, and Francis I of France, have just shaken hands and sworn friendship in something called the Treaty of Toledo. For Henry, this is the Tudor version of seeing your two exes start a podcast together. They've basically agreed, no deals, no chats, no alliances with that troublesome English king who can't keep a wife alive or a religion straight. In other words, Henry is alone, politically single. And no one hates being single more than Henry VIII. The once golden prince who'd strutted through his youth, collecting titles, wives, and tournament trophies, now finds himself surrounded by whispers and empty courtyards. The rest of Europe has moved on. Even the Pope stopped returning his calls, though to be fair, that might have had something to do with the whole founding your own church situation. England at this point is the friend who keeps getting uninvited to group chats. The Reformation is spreading, alliances are shifting, and Henry keeps thinking he's the main character. He needs someone, anyone, to validate that he's still a serious political power, preferably someone who looks good on a coin. Enter Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, lawyer, reformer, part-time miracle worker, and full-time problem solver. Cromwell sees the danger immediately. England is isolated, enemies are circling, and the king's loneliness is starting to look like a national security risk. So he does what any clever bureaucrat would do. he goes shopping for a wife. Cromwell starts scanning Europe's eligible royal women like a man scrolling through a very selective dating app. Catholic? Too risky. French? Too flirty. Spanish? Don't even mention it. But then there's Cleves. Small, Protestant-leaning, strategically placed between France and the Empire. Neutral enough to keep England safe, powerful enough to annoy the Pope. And conveniently, Duke Wilhelm of Cleves has an unmarried sister, Anne. Now, Cromwell isn't thinking about love. He's thinking about balance sheets, military logistics, trade routes. To him, Anne of Cleves isn't a romance. She's a solution. So he brings the idea to Henry. You can imagine the conversation. Cromwell: Your Majesty, I've found you a bride who will unite England with the Protestant states of Germany. The political advantages? Henry: Is she pretty? Cromwell: Majesty, she brings access to strategic trade and... Henry: Pretty, Thomas. Focus. Cromwell, ever the diplomat, lies in the only way a man can when his life depends on it. Cromwell: Majesty, her beauty is said to excel that of Christina of Milan. Now, Christina of Milan was the one that got away. The woman who told Henry she'd marry him only if she had two heads, one to keep after you chop off the other. So Cromwell knows exactly what name to drop. Henry perks up instantly. Excellent, he says. Send for her portrait. Let's see the merchandise. And so Holbein is dispatched, the portrait is painted, and the court collectively exhales. For once, it looks like the king's midlife crisis might benefit the country. But here's where the story tilts from politics to farce. Cromwell's grand diplomatic vision, the Protestant alliance that would save England, is built entirely on Henry's ability to sit through a wedding without throwing a tantrum. Which, if you know Henry, is asking a lot. While ambassadors in Europe are drafting careful letters about unity and shared faith, Henry is writing love notes to the painting. He's convinced this will be his happy ending. After years of chaos, here's a woman who won't remind him of his failures, or worse, have opinions. He wants a love story. Europe, however, is about to send him a legal contract. Because that's what marriage among royals really was. Paperwork disguised as passion. Every clause mattered. How big is her dowry? What happens if there's no heir? Who controls which ports? Every detail debated, every signature weighed. It's the least romantic thing in the world. Cromwell, sitting in his office surrounded by scrolls and candle wax, can already sense the coming storm. He spent months negotiating with the Duke of Cleves, smoothing over minor crises, making sure the fine print won't anger the king. Henry, meanwhile, is pacing around Hampton Court talking about destiny. The difference between the two men is almost comical. Cromwell sees geopolitics, Henry sees poetry. Cromwell sees Protestant solidarity. Henry sees a beautiful stranger in a painting. Cromwell's version of marriage is a binding treaty. Henry's version is a musical montage where he sweeps into a room and everyone faints from admiration. But the political stakes are real. The Treaty of Toledo has locked England out of Catholic diplomacy. France and the Empire are now allies, and if they ever decide to invade, England's navy isn't big enough to stop them. Cromwell needs Cleves to keep Henry safe, even if it means tethering him to a woman who doesn't fit his fantasies. The paperwork is finished by late 1539. The ink dries, the seals are pressed, and the royal couriers ride through the cold winter, carrying news of the engagement. England celebrates, cautiously. The people don't know much about Anne, but they like the idea of peace. They've seen too many heads roll. A little stability sounds nice. Anne, meanwhile, packs her belongings in quiet obedience. She's heard Henry's name her entire life. The famous English king who defied the Pope, the widower of multiple wives, the man whose temper is as legendary as his appetite. Still, this is her duty. She doesn't dream of love, but she hopes for respect. She leaves Cleves in December, her ship cutting through ice on the Rhine, bound for a country that will call her by another name. Back in London, Cromwell can barely sleep. If this marriage works, he'll be celebrated as the savior of England. If it fails, he'll be lucky to keep his head. Henry, oblivious to the tension, is rehearsing the first meeting in his mind. He imagines himself in disguise, charming, mysterious, like a knight from one of his old pageants. It never occurs to him that no woman has ever found that trick appealing. That's the heart of Tudor politics in a single image. A man dreaming of love while his minister prays the paperwork holds. By New Year's Day, 1540, everything is set. The alliance is public, the ships are ready, and England is buzzing. Holbein's portrait hangs in Henry's chambers, still perfect, still silent. And somewhere in a cabin across the channel, Anne of Cleves sits quietly, unaware that her entire worth to her new husband has already been reduced to that painting. This is the difference between what she wants and what he expects. Anne wants peace. Henry wants poetry. Anne expects formality. Henry expects fireworks. But for all the grand politics, all the pomp and ceremony, this story is still about a woman who never got to choose. Every step of this negotiation, every word of that treaty, was written by men who saw her as a symbol, not a person. She didn't ask to be England's savior. She didn't ask to be paraded as proof of a Protestant alliance. She didn't ask to be painted into someone else's idea of love. And soon, she'll learn what happens when a man who wants affection meets a woman who's been trained her whole life to prioritize duty. Because Henry VIII, the self-styled romantic hero, is about to discover what no one dares tell him. You can't negotiate desire through paperwork. And Thomas Cromwell, poor man, is about to realize that sometimes saving the kingdom means introducing your king to the one woman who will make him feel completely powerless. It's the first morning of 1540, cold and sharp, with frost glinting on the roads that snake toward Rochester Castle. Inside, fires burn low and servants scurry about, whispering about the royal visitor expected later that day. Anne of Cleves has just arrived in England, weary from travel but still curious, still hopeful. Her hair is tucked neatly beneath her headdress. Her German ladies bustle around her, and she's trying, in her steady way, to make sense of a country where even the language sounds like it's constantly apologizing. This is supposed to be a peaceful morning, but in a nearby town, Henry VIII is already awake and restless, plotting something theatrical. He's decided, in his infinite self-confidence, that his first meeting with his bride will be like something out of a romance. He'll disguise himself as a humble messenger, sneak into her rooms unannounced, and, through the sheer electric force of destiny, she'll know him. She'll throw herself into his arms, sigh, "My king," and everyone will clap. He loves this idea. No one else does. But Henry has built his entire personality around being adored, and at this point in his life, he's running dangerously low on both adoration and cartilage. Still, the plan goes ahead. A few courtiers, trying not to look horrified, help him into his disguise. It's not convincing. Henry is enormous now, his once athletic frame thickened by years of excess, and that festering wound on his leg that never really healed. His armor no longer fits. He moves with a heavy limp, puffing slightly as he insists on secrecy. The courtiers nod, smiling tightly. Because when your boss has executed 2 wives, you don't critique his romantic strategy. And so, England's most powerful man climbs into his costume. Plain brown cloak, soft cap, maybe a spritz of something floral to mask the faint odor of decay, and sets off toward Rochester. Inside the castle, Anne has no idea what's about to happen. She's been told that the king will visit soon, but no one said he'd appear in disguise like a wandering troubadour. She's seated by the window, practicing her English greetings, repeating, "Your Majesty," in a soft, uncertain accent. Her ladies murmur encouragements. She's nervous, of course, but determined to make a good impression. Then the door bursts open. A group of men enter, laughing, cloaks drawn tight against the cold. One of them, larger than the rest, steps forward. He's red-faced, breathing hard from the climb, and for a moment she assumes he's some overeager servant come to deliver news. He strides right up to her and, without introduction, without bow, without explanation, kisses her. Anne freezes. There's an instant of silence, then confusion, then horror. Who is this man? Why has a stranger touched her? She jerks back, eyes wide, cheeks flushed with shock. Her attendants gasp, half standing, unsure whether to intervene or faint. Henry, meanwhile, is smiling proudly. He expects tears of joy, recognition, maybe even applause. Instead, he sees a woman staring at him as if he's just tracked mud across her prayer rug. He waits for her to swoon. She waits for him to apologize. The pause stretches long enough to kill an empire. Finally, Anne collects herself and offers a polite curtsy, the kind one gives to a man of moderate importance and questionable hygiene. "Thank you, sir," she says in careful English. "You are very kind." Henry blinks. Kind? Kind? This is not how royal love stories go. In that moment, something inside him snaps. Not audibly, like a tendon or a chair leg, but emotionally. The great romantic gesture has landed with all the grace of a falling turkey. He mutters something unintelligible, turns on his heel, and storms out, leaving Anne completely bewildered. Outside the chamber, his attendants scramble to follow. His face is blotchy with embarrassment, his mood turning darker by the step. "I like her not," he growls to Thomas Cromwell, who's jogging beside him, praying silently for the ground to open up and swallow them both. "I like her not." And there it is. The sentence that will undo months of diplomacy, reshape alliances, and ruin Cromwell's career. Anne, meanwhile, sits quietly where he left her, surrounded by whispers she can't understand. She asks one of her ladies who that strange, sweaty man was. When she learns the truth, that it was the King of England, she's mortified. She insists on sending word that she hadn't recognized him, that she hadn't meant to offend. She even blames herself for not reacting properly to a situation that was, by any measure, absurd. Henry doesn't want to hear it. His pride is wounded, and that for him is worse than any physical pain. His leg may already be rotting, but now his vanity joins in. The man who built his entire self-image on being irresistible has just discovered that his new bride didn't swoon on sight. To make matters worse, his courtiers, ever eager to mirror his moods, start muttering about how, perhaps the Lady Anne's charms are subtle, which is Tudor court code for, "We don't want to die, so we'll pretend she's plain." The gossip spreads like spilled ink. By the time Henry reaches his chambers that night, the story has evolved. The king's new bride is dull, unattractive, possibly even ugly. And conveniently, No one will dare contradict him. Imagine the scene from Anne's perspective. A foreign land, a strange language, a husband you've never met, and suddenly everyone's whispering that you've failed a test you didn't even know you were taking. She doesn't cry in public. She never does. But her attendants note how quiet she becomes, how her hands tremble slightly when she signs her letters home. Henry, of course, can't leave it alone. By the time they meet formally the next day, this time with trumpets, banners, and the correct number of curtsies, the damage is already done. He goes through the motions of politeness, but his enthusiasm has evaporated. Every word he speaks is laced with disappointment. It's almost tragic, really. Not because of what happens, but because of how avoidable it all was. Two people trapped by expectation. A man chasing the ghost of his own youth. A woman trying to live up to a portrait. Neither of them the villain exactly. Just unwilling participants in the Tudor version of a blind date gone catastrophically wrong. When Henry finally retires that evening, his attendants report that he muttered the same words over and over. I like her not. Not a scream, not a roar, just a sulky repetition, like a child refusing dinner. Cromwell, meanwhile, is pacing his rooms, calculating how many ways this could destroy him. The Protestant alliance, the treaty, months of negotiation, all teetering, because his royal master couldn't resist an overdramatic prank. The next morning, Anne dresses for their wedding with quiet resolve. She doesn't know the full extent of the disaster yet, but she can feel it. That subtle shift in the air when affection curdles into judgment. Still, she stands tall, her gown heavy with brocade, her hands steady. She does what she's been taught to do her entire life. Carry on. Henry arrives late, limping, scowling, still trapped in the humiliation of that failed disguise. The ceremony is solemn, efficient, and joyless. When the vows are spoken, he stares straight ahead. When the ring slips onto her finger, he exhales as though the entire thing were an inconvenience. Everyone in attendance knows something has gone terribly wrong, but no one says it aloud. Not yet. Later, Henry will tell his advisors he found Anne so unattractive that he couldn't fulfill his husbandly duties. He'll claim that her looks repelled him, that her figure was unappealing, that her manner was dull. All lies, of course, polite disguises for the truth he can't face. That his ego couldn't survive rejection, however unintentional. And so, with one awkward kiss and one wounded pride, an entire marriage begins to unravel before it's even begun. For Anne, it's the start of a bewildering nightmare, one where every smile is misinterpreted, every silence condemned. For Henry, it's the moment his vanity turns into policy. And for England, it's the day a king's foolish prank becomes a national embarrassment. The tragedy of Anne of Cleves didn't begin with cruelty. It began with a kiss. The candles burned low in the royal bedchamber that January night. The air was thick with the sweet scent of beeswax, and the faint metallic tang of winter seeping through the shutters. Everything was ready. The silks laid out, the sheets turned down, the ceremonial expectations of a royal marriage humming just beneath the silence. Anne of Cleves stood there, waiting. She was dressed for her wedding night in the fashion of her homeland, modest, layered, everything precisely arranged. Around her, the servants bowed and whispered, retreating like waves pulling away from shore. When the door finally closed, it was just the two of them, the new Queen of England and her very reluctant king. Henry looked at her for a long moment. Not the kind of look that weighs affection or admiration, more the way a man stares at an awkward painting he commissioned and isn't quite sure how to return. Anne smiled politely, unsure whether to curtsy again or simply breathe. The silence stretched. At last, Henry mumbled a few words, perfunctory, distracted. Then he approached, kissed her lightly, and announced, almost to himself, "Good night, sweetheart." Then he turned, waddled to his side of the bed, and within minutes, the King of England was snoring like a satisfied ox. Anne lay there, eyes open in the dark, heart racing with a mixture of relief and confusion. Was this normal? Morning came. Henry stirred, looked at her again, perhaps murmured a sleepy greeting. Then, as if repeating a ritual, he gave her another quick kiss. "Good morning, darling." And that was that. To Anne, this seemed simple enough. The king had kissed her. They had shared a bed. Surely the marriage was sealed. No one had explained the rest. She'd been raised in Cleves, where such matters weren't exactly discussed over breakfast. Her education had been about governance and grace, not anatomy. The practicalities of marriage were, quite literally, foreign to her. Later that day, chatting with her ladies-in-waiting, Anne confessed what had happened. Or rather, what hadn't. She laughed a little, nervous but cheerful, describing how kind and gentle the king had been. "He kisses me good night," she said, "and in the morning he kisses me again. Is this not enough?" The room went quiet. Her ladies exchanged glances. One of them, braver than the rest, tried delicately to explain that no, that was not enough. Anne blinked, startled. She had no reason to doubt the king's methods. How was she to know that England expected more? That conversation, whispered among women in private, would soon become one of the most famous anecdotes in Tudor history, the story of the wedding night that never happened. Meanwhile, Henry was already working on his own version of events, and his was considerably less innocent. By morning, he was complaining to his physician, to his friends, to anyone who would listen. "I cannot," he declared, "perform my husbandly duties." The implication was clear. He had tried, but alas, nature itself refused him success. The blame, naturally, belonged to her. He described her as unattractive, unappealing, even odorous. A convenient fiction to mask his own humiliation. His words traveled faster than truth. Within days, the entire court knew the king's opinion. His new wife was impossible. And here's where you have to pause and appreciate Henry's talent for self-deception. This is a man with a festering leg wound, a body swollen from years of indulgence, and a temper so legendary that people flinched when he breathed too loudly. Yet he managed to convince himself that the problem wasn't him. It was her. He bragged to his physician that he was perfectly capable, thank you very much. He even shared that he'd experienced nocturnal emissions, which, translated from Tudor medical language, means he was eager to prove his manhood without actually having to demonstrate it in practice. Henry bragged about being perfectly capable. Sure, Jan. What he never admitted, of course, was that his pride had been injured long before the wedding night, that first failed meeting at Rochester still festering in his ego like the wound on his leg. Anne's polite bewilderment, her lack of instant adoration, had bruised something deep inside him. And Henry, being Henry, couldn't bear the idea that anyone, let alone a woman, might find him less than irresistible. So he rewrote the narrative. The English court became a whispering theater of humiliation. Courtiers murmured that the new queen was dull, that she smelled foreign, that she lacked refinement. No one had the courage to challenge the king's opinion, and so it became truth by repetition. Anne, meanwhile, was oblivious. She went about her duties with her quiet dignity, attending Mass, learning English, writing letters home about her kind husband. She smiled at the courtiers who avoided her eyes, not realizing that her smile itself had become the subject of mockery. Imagine it, being spoken of, judged, and dissected in a language you barely understand, in rooms that go silent when you enter. Imagine being blamed for the insecurities of a man the size of 2 thrones. The cruelty of it wasn't loud or violent. It was subtle, whispered, bureaucratic. Henry didn't rage at her. Not yet. He simply withdrew, using politeness as a weapon. He stopped visiting her chamber. He stopped eating with her. And every morning, as she waited, hopeful for another kiss, another greeting, the hours stretched longer, emptier. Cromwell, the architect of this disaster, tried to calm his master. "Majesty," he said carefully, "perhaps with time." Henry cut him off. "I like her not." The same words again, dull and heavy with finality. And that was that. The king's verdict was law. Anne still tried. She wore the gowns chosen for her, learned English songs, tried to adopt English manners. She laughed at the right moments, even though she didn't always understand the jokes. She did everything a queen should do, except, of course, please her husband. And how could she? She wasn't competing with real women. She was competing with ghosts. The memory of Anne Boleyn's charm, Jane Seymour's docility, the image of youth and beauty that Henry still imagined himself deserving. Every smile she offered, every polite word, was met with silence. The courtiers' eyes slid away from her. The servants whispered that she slept alone. She didn't even know why she was failing. That's the cruelest part of all. Henry's shame became her scandal. His impotence became her flaw. And Anne, so careful, so dignified, so endlessly polite, didn't even know what sin she'd committed. The court turned her into a joke. The queen who repelled the king. The phrase began to circulate, always behind her back, always with the same forced laughter. And yet, in the midst of it all, Anne remained steady. She didn't lash out, didn't cry in public, didn't protest. Perhaps she didn't fully understand what was being said, or perhaps she did, and simply refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. In her quiet way, she became the calm center of Henry's storm. He could humiliate her, but she wouldn't humiliate herself. Still, the humiliation was real. Every morning, as she dressed in her heavy Tudor gown, she knew the whispers were still there, circling her like smoke. She'd been in England for only weeks, but already she was trapped in a play she hadn't auditioned for. The irony, of course, is that the marriage wasn't a tragedy yet. Not officially. There were no accusations, no annulments, no heads on spikes. Just silence. Cold, deliberate silence. And in that silence, Anne of Cleves, the quiet, practical woman from the middle of the map, began to understand something important. In Cleves, she had learned to endure rules made by men. But in England, she was discovering something worse. Men who rewrote the rules whenever they pleased. It was the beginning of her undoing. And strangely, the beginning of her survival. Because while Henry was busy turning his failure into her fault, Anne was learning to master the only art that would keep her alive, the art of saying nothing and meaning everything. And if you've listened all the way to this point, silently judging Henry like the rest of us, then you owe Anne and me a small favor. Tap subscribe. It costs you nothing, but it keeps good history alive. And unlike Henry, you can actually commit. By June of 1540, London was heavy with summer heat and gossip. Courtiers fanned themselves with letters, pretending to discuss theology while whispering about the king's new plan. Because, of course, Henry VIII always had a new plan, and it usually involved paperwork and someone else's heartbreak. Anne of Cleves was still queen in name, but everyone in the palace already sensed the wind changing direction. Henry had stopped visiting her rooms entirely. He barely acknowledged her in public. She could feel the space between them widening, turning from silence into exile. The servants began to avoid her eyes. The ladies of the court, once warm, curious, even sympathetic, now grew distant. Anne knew something was coming. You don't survive royal courts without recognizing when people start stepping away to save themselves. Then one morning, a knock came at her chamber door. A royal messenger, pale and sweating, handed her a parchment sealed with the king's emblem. She broke it open with careful fingers. It was an annulment request. The reason? Henry claimed their marriage was invalid. She had been previously betrothed to another, he said. A technicality so old and irrelevant, it barely qualified as an excuse. He also declared with great magnanimity that they had never consummated the marriage. Anne sat perfectly still, reading the lines twice, then a third time, and for the first time in months, she cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, into the same hands that had once been folded in prayer for the husband who never came to her bed. It wasn't heartbreak. It was humiliation. She had done everything right, everything expected of her, and still somehow she was the problem. But once the tears dried, something shifted. She realized, with that same practical clarity she'd carried from Cleves, that there was no winning this by protest. Henry didn't want a wife. He wanted escape. And Anne, being Anne, understood that survival sometimes meant letting go before the other person forced your hand. Henry expected rage. She gave him grace, which for him was way scarier. While the king and his council prepared for battle, she quietly surrendered. No speeches, no accusations, no begging. Just calm acceptance. If it pleases His Majesty, she said simply, then so it must be. Those words, soft, dignified, dangerous, changed everything. Henry was stunned. He had braced himself for defiance, for weeping, for the endless drama that usually followed his romantic disasters. But instead, Anne handed him peace. She gave him something he'd never had from any of his wives before. No trouble. And for that, he rewarded her in the only way a man like Henry knew how, with property and titles. The annulment went through in early July. By decree of Parliament, their marriage was declared invalid, and Anne of Cleves became the king's beloved sister. That title was half courtesy, half consolation prize, but it came with benefits that would make even the most heartbroken woman feel a little better. She was granted Richmond Palace for her use, plus Bletchingley Manor in Surrey, later Hever Castle, the former home of Anne Boleyn's family. The irony was delicious. She was moving into the estate once owned by the woman who'd lost her head to the same man now paying Anne's rent. She also received a generous income, servants, jewels, and the right to attend court whenever she wished. In short, Anne divorced Henry VIII and got a mansion. That's not failure, that's strategy. Cromwell, however, wasn't so lucky. The man who had arranged the marriage was now the scapegoat for its collapse. Within weeks of the annulment, he was arrested and accused of treason. Henry signed his death warrant with the same hand that had signed Anne's settlement. When the news reached her, she bowed her head. Cromwell had been the architect of her misfortune, yes, but also the man who'd tried to secure her safety afterward. She wrote a brief note of condolence to one of his friends. It was simple, direct, and respectful, like everything she did. As for Henry, he was back to preening. He boasted about how merciful he'd been, how generously he'd treated Anne. He told anyone who'd listen that she had agreed to the annulment with sisterly affection, as though her composure had been affection rather than intelligence. He even invited her to court dinners, seating her near him like an honored guest. And Anne? She came, smiling, graceful, perfectly polite. The courtiers were baffled. She chatted with the king, toasted his health, and laughed softly at his jokes. You could almost hear the collective thought around the table. How is she this calm? But that was her genius. She'd turned defeat into stability, rejection into privilege. She had no crown, but she had security. And in Henry's England, that was worth more than love. From her new estates, she wrote letters to her family in Cleves. The tone was gentle, pragmatic. "I am in good health," she assured them. "The king treats me as his sister." Between the lines, though, you can sense her relief. She was free from the pressure of court politics, free from expectation. She could finally breathe. At Bletchingley, her days were quiet and filled with order. She oversaw the kitchens, the stables, the gardens. She went hunting, played cards, visited nearby monasteries. She had an income large enough to live well, and for the first time in her life, she could make her own decisions. Sometimes, on warm afternoons, she would ride through her lands, the air heavy with the scent of hay, the sunlight gilding the fields, and she would think about how strange it all was. She had come to England as a bride and ended up something rarer, a woman who'd survived Henry VIII and somehow managed to keep her head and her property. That made her, technically, the most successful of all his wives. The courtiers began to notice too. Over time, the ugly queen became something else, a respected figure, admired for her calm and her cleverness. Even Henry, with his mercurial moods, continued to treat her kindly. He visited her from time to time, sharing meals and gossip, calling her sister. Whether that was guilt or genuine affection, no one could tell, but Anne accepted it all with the same serene composure that had saved her. She didn't remarry. She didn't seek scandal or flirtation. She didn't need to. While Henry's next wife, the young and reckless Catherine Howard, danced her way toward disaster, Anne stayed right where she was, comfortable, quiet, and alive. If you ever visit Hever Castle, you can almost imagine her there, walking through the gardens in the late afternoon light, her gown brushing the grass, her laughter soft but real this time. The servants adored her. The locals called her generous. And history, grudgingly, began to call her wise. Because in the end, Anne of Cleves understood something Henry never did. Power isn't just about having control. It's about knowing when to surrender it on your own terms. She didn't win her story by fighting. She won it by yielding with grace, by turning her obedience into autonomy. Henry VIII wanted a queen to worship him. What he got instead was a woman who outlived him, outsmarted him, and walked away richer. And that, dear listener, is how Anne of Cleves turned a royal rejection into her own quiet coronation. There's a certain peace that settles over a life when the chaos finally stops. For Anne of Cleves, that peace came not in a coronation, not in love, not even in vindication, but in the quiet, steady rhythm of ordinary days. After the annulment, while London moved on to its next scandal, because with Henry, there was always a next scandal, Anne built something rare in Tudor England: stability. She settled into her new homes like someone finally exhaling after years of holding her breath. Bletchingley Manor, with its rolling green fields and distant church bells, became her refuge. Hever Castle, with its moats and climbing roses, her summer retreat. She decorated both with a mix of English tapestries and German furnishings, a small rebellion of comfort and memory. Servants who worked for her later said she liked things tidy, but not tense, an unusual concept in a century where most nobles managed their staff with threats and suspicion. Anne didn't do suspicion. She did warmth in her quiet, measured way. She rose early, kept her own schedule, and loved the gardens most of all. There was something about the neatness of growing things, the order of nature, the predictability of seasons, that felt right to her. After years spent in palaces where the smallest rumor could kill, a patch of lavender was better company than any duke. You can imagine her there, pruning a rosebush with a small, satisfied smile, sunlight catching on her rings. She had no crown now, but she had freedom. For the first time, every hour of the day belonged to her, and in that freedom, something unexpected blossomed. Friendship. Anne became close with Henry's daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, two girls who had grown up in the long shadow of their father's temper. Mary, serious and devout, admired Anne's piety. Elizabeth, sharp and observant even as a child, adored Anne's calm intelligence. They visited her estates often. To them, Anne wasn't a stepmother. She was something gentler, wiser, safer. When Elizabeth later became queen, she would speak fondly of "my good Aunt of Cleves." And there's something telling about that. Elizabeth, the daughter of the wife Henry executed, found comfort in the wife he couldn't. Anne's ability to adapt made her a survivor. She had come from a land divided by faith, and England wasn't any simpler. Kings changed religion like they changed favorites. 1 month Catholic, the next Protestant, then somewhere confusingly in between. But Anne never got caught in the middle of the storm. She attended Mass when it pleased the Catholics, and communion when it pleased the Protestants. She kept both sets of prayer books neatly shelved. Some called her inconsistent. They were wrong. Anne wasn't indecisive. She was alive. Which is more than Henry's next wife could say. She had learned early that ideology was a dangerous luxury. The people who survived the Tudor court weren't the loudest believers. They were the ones who knew when to nod, smile, and quietly step out of the room. Anne stepped out of many rooms, and because of that, she stepped into old age. Her generosity became something of a legend. She paid her servants well, left them gifts, remembered birthdays. One man wrote years later that her grace was ever gentle to her household and gave cheerfully to all who served. In a time when most nobles treated servants as expendable, Anne treated them like family. There's an image of her that lingers, sitting by the fire on winter evenings, her small household gathered around her, listening as she read from a book or told stories of Cleves. She had a soft laugh, they said. You could hear it down the hall, like a low bell. The same woman Henry once described as dull had become the calmest presence in England. Even Henry, in his later years, would visit her from time to time. He'd arrive bloated and irritable, complaining about politics or his ulcered leg, and Anne would pour him wine and listen. She never reproached him, never reminded him of the disaster he'd made of their marriage. She was polite, even affectionate, the way one might be with a stubborn relative who doesn't realize how ridiculous he sounds. And perhaps Henry knew it. Perhaps that's why he always left her house a little lighter, a little quieter. Anne had become something none of his other wives ever managed to be: safe. After Henry's death in 1547, England shifted again. The throne passed to his young son Edward VI, then to Mary I, and later to Elizabeth II. Each brought new laws, new faiths, new expectations. Through it all, Anne kept her head down and her gardens growing. She wrote occasional letters to her brother in Cleves, thanking him for his concern, assuring him she lived well. She never returned home. England, for better or worse, had become hers. By the 1550s, Anne had become something of a local legend. The Quiet Queen, they called her, though she was technically no queen at all. She hosted small gatherings, gave alms to the poor, and spent long afternoons walking the grounds of Hever. Sometimes she'd pause by the lake, watching her reflection ripple in the water. She'd been a duchess, a queen, a sister, and finally, just a woman with her own estate and her own peace. For someone who'd been dragged into the chaos of Henry VIII's life, that peace must have felt like a miracle. She wasn't a reformer or a saint or a ruler, but she was a survivor. And in the Tudor age, that was rarer than all three combined. Anne never remarried. When people asked why, she smiled faintly and said, "One king is quite enough." It wasn't bitterness, it was wisdom. Her later years were calm, steady, and beautifully ordinary. There were no more portraits, no more treaties, no more drama. Just letters, gardens, and small kindnesses that rippled quietly through the people who served her. And when England spoke of her now, it was no longer as the ugly queen. It was as the good Lady Anne. She'd outlived the king who humiliated her, outlasted the court that mocked her, and earned something no crown could give: the luxury of peace. There's a lesson there, whispered softly through the centuries. Not every triumph looks like victory. Sometimes it looks like surviving the worst man in Europe and spending your afternoons planting herbs. Anne of Cleves understood that. She'd walked through scandal and come out the other side without bitterness. She'd seen how power devoured those who chased it, and she'd chosen peace instead. And if you were to walk past her garden one evening in the fading light, to see her among the flowers, her hands brushing the lavender, her smile faint but content, you might realize something Henry never did. The quiet ones don't always lose. Sometimes they just stop playing the game. By the winter of 1557, Anne of Cleves was no longer the vibrant, steady figure who had once outlived the worst husband in England. Time, at last, had caught up to her, gently but firmly, like an old friend reminding her that peace has its limits too. She was living quietly at Chelsea Old Manor, one of the properties she'd been granted after her annulment. The rooms were warm, comfortable, filled with soft cushions and embroidered draperies, the kind that hinted at a woman who liked beauty but had long ago stopped chasing splendor. Outside, the Thames rolled slow and dark beneath the gray sky. Anne was in her early 40s, not old by modern standards, but in Tudor England, it might as well have been a lifetime. She had survived plague, politics, religion, and Henry VIII. But now her body, always so obedient, was beginning to give way. Illness came quietly, a lingering fever, a weakness in her limbs, the slow heaviness that makes stairs seem taller and days seem longer. Servants whispered their concern, doctors murmured about humors and vapors, and Anne, ever practical, simply smiled and told them not to fuss. But she knew, and being Anne of Cleves, she prepared. It started with the little things, sorting her jewelry, organizing her linens, deciding which portrait to keep near her bed. Then came the papers. She had always been meticulous. Even dying, she was doing HR paperwork. The woman was organized. On July 12th, 1557, Anne dictated her will. Her voice was weaker now, but calm, deliberate. Every word chosen carefully, like the folds of a well-pressed gown. She began, as all good Tudor wills did, with God. Then came the details. Practical, generous, and entirely revealing of who she was. To her servants, she left money, enough for each of them to live comfortably, to marry, to start anew. She remembered them all by name. It wasn't grand wealth. It was something better. Kindness turned into currency. To her family back in Cleves, she sent jewelry and fine clothing. They'd long since stopped expecting anything from her. But she wanted them to have proof that she had lived well, that England had been kind in the end. And to the poor, she left alms, food, money, and clothing to be distributed after her death. Even in her final hours, she was still managing her household like the good duchess she'd always been. There's something deeply moving about it. A woman who once held the title of Queen of England, sitting in bed, planning wages and cloth allowances for people who'd spent their lives in her service. No grandeur, no theatrics, just the quiet dignity of someone making sure everything would still run smoothly when she wasn't there. She even dictated instructions for her burial. "I desire," she said, "to be buried wherever it shall please the Queen's Majesty." That Queen's Majesty was Mary I, Henry's eldest daughter, who now sat on the throne. And Mary, to her credit, had always treated Anne with deep affection. Anne had, after all, been one of the few people who had shown kindness to her during her father's reign. It's a strange sort of poetry, the former queen leaving her final rest in the hands of the daughter of the man who had discarded her. But that was Anne, endlessly pragmatic, endlessly forgiving. She had long ago made peace with the idea that her life was part of someone else's story. When her lawyer read the will back to her, she listened closely, correcting small details with that same quiet precision that had once terrified her clerks. Then she nodded and smiled faintly. "That will do," she whispered. After that, she mostly slept. The fever deepened. Her appetite faded. The household moved quietly, the air filled with the soft shuffle of slippers and the muted chime of church bells from across the river. In her final days, she was never alone. Her attendants took turns sitting by her bedside, reading aloud from prayer books, sometimes singing the hymns she loved from her childhood in Cleves. She would occasionally wake and murmur a thank you, always polite, always composed. And then, one morning in mid-July, the Duchess who had once been queen simply didn't wake up. Anne of Cleves died peacefully, with no drama, no scandal, and no unfinished business. In a life surrounded by noise, she left the world in silence. The news spread through the court softly. There were no mourning parades, no public outbursts. Just a quiet sadness, a recognition that one of the few truly blameless figures in Henry VIII's chaotic life had gone. Queen Mary ordered that she be buried with full honors, as befitted her station. She was interred in Westminster Abbey, not far from the resting places of her former stepchildren. It was the burial of a royal, though her name would not appear on the grand monuments. In a sense, that was fitting. Anne had never needed marble to prove her worth. Her life had been its own monument, a lesson in dignity, restraint, and survival. But there's still a melancholy in it. For all her grace and composure, she died owning nothing permanently. The castles, the manors, the jewels, all reverted to the crown, because technically she had never really belonged in England. She'd lived a borrowed life, in a borrowed kingdom. And yet what she left behind mattered far more than property. She left behind stories whispered by servants who remembered her laughter, gardens still blooming where she'd once walked, and the small, unshakable truth that kindness can outlast power. It's hard not to picture her in those final moments, the flicker of candlelight reflecting in her open Bible, the room filled with the faint scent of lavender from her gardens, the river murmuring outside. Maybe she thought briefly of Cleves, the calm gray castles of her youth, the childhood she'd left behind when she crossed the sea. Maybe she thought of Henry, not with bitterness, but with that same bemused understanding she'd always shown. He had been her trial, but also her teacher, because from him she had learned that peace is not given by kings. It's made by choosing not to play their game. And so, in the quietest possible way, Anne of Cleves did what no one else in Tudor England ever managed to do. She lived through Henry VIII and left the story on her own terms. She ended as she had lived, steady, self-possessed, and quietly triumphant. A will neatly signed, a whisper of prayer, and then nothing but peace. The candles burned low, the church bells tolled, and England's quietest queen rested, finally, in silence. It was a gray July morning when London carried its quietest queen to rest. The bells of Westminster tolled not for triumph, not for scandal, but for peace. Anne of Cleves's funeral was small, dignified, and strangely serene. There were no lavish parades, no royal trumpets, no grieving widower to stand beside the coffin. Just a procession of clergy, courtiers, and servants, the same people she had once paid, fed, and treated with such unfashionable kindness. They walked slowly, their footsteps echoing through the abbey cloisters, as if the building itself recognized that this was a different kind of queen. Anne's coffin, draped in black velvet, was carried into Westminster Abbey, the same church where England's kings and queens had been crowned, married, and buried for centuries. But her place was not among the grand tombs of Henry or Edward or Mary. No, Anne was laid to rest in a smaller chapel, the one dedicated to St. Edmund, tucked off to the side, quiet, humble. There she was buried beside the very daughters of the man who once discarded her, Mary Y. and Elizabeth Y., though none of them could have known in that moment how history would make that proximity poetic. It's a small space, the chapel of St. Edmund. The air feels old there, cool still, scented faintly with stone and candle wax. You wouldn't find Anne's tomb easily unless you knew where to look. It doesn't rise grandly from the floor like Henry's. It doesn't command the center aisle. It sits along the north wall, a modest slab of marble set beneath a carved canopy. No crown, no effigy, just her name. Or rather, eventually, her name. Because for nearly 300 years, Anne of Cleves lay in Westminster Abbey without a visible marker. Her tomb was plain, uninscribed, almost invisible. People walked past it daily, unaware that one of the most remarkable survivors of Tudor England was resting beneath their feet. You could say there was poetic justice in that too. Henry's ego got marble statues, full Latin inscriptions, and eternal publicity. Anne got peace, and honestly, that's the better deal. After all, Henry's monument in St. George's Chapel is as grand as his appetites. Angels carved in stone, gilt canopies, elaborate prayers for a soul that probably didn't listen. But if you stand before Anne's resting place, what you feel isn't power, it's quiet. The kind of peace she'd spent her whole life learning to keep. Her funeral, simple as it was, carried touches of affection that said more than royal ceremony ever could. Mary I, the same Mary who'd once been cast aside by her father, ordered the service to be conducted with full royal honors. She made sure Anne's debts were paid, her servants looked after, her memory respected. It was Mary's way of saying thank you, because in a court that devoured women, Anne had been kind to the ones who came after her. She had shown young Elizabeth patience when no one else dared. She had comforted Mary when her faith made her unpopular. She had done what Henry never did. She treated them like family. So Mary honored her beloved aunt with dignity. The coffin was carried through the abbey while choirs sang psalms, their voices rising up into the vaulted ceiling. A bishop read her will aloud, praising her for her generosity. There were tears, quiet ones, dignified ones, from servants who had known her not as queen, but as Madame Anne. When the service ended, they sealed her tomb. There was no fanfare, no marble angels, no desperate attempt to impress God. Just a prayer, a candle, and silence. And that somehow feels fitting. Anne had spent her entire life being measured against noise. Henry's noise, the court's noise, history's noise. She had never been allowed to simply be. In death, she finally got that. Centuries passed. Kings came and went. Empires rose and fell. And Anne of Cleves stayed there, resting quietly beneath the abbey stones, while above her, pilgrims and tourists and monarchs moved on with the business of forgetting. Her grave remained nameless until the 19th century, when scholars rediscovered the burial record and marked it properly. Today, if you visit, you'll find a modest inscription: Anne of Cleves, Queen of England, 1540. That's all it says. No birth date, no epitaph, no beloved sister of the king. Just those 3 lines. And somehow, that simplicity feels perfect, because Anne never needed words to prove her worth. Her life had been her statement, a slow, graceful defiance of every rule Henry tried to impose. She'd shown the world that dignity doesn't need a crown, that silence can be power, that survival can be the loudest form of rebellion. When you stand there, reading that small inscription, you can almost hear the echo of her story in the stones around you. The abbey hums with the ghosts of queens: Catherine of Aragon's steadfast faith, Anne Boleyn's fury, Jane Seymour's tragedy, Catherine Howard's youth, Catherine Parr's intelligence, and in the middle of them all, Anne of Cleves, calm, patient, enduring. She was never meant to be remarkable. Yet somehow she became unforgettable, because think about it, of all Henry's wives, she was the only one who truly outsmarted him. Catherine of Aragon fought him. Anne Boleyn challenged him. Jane Seymour obeyed him. Catherine Howard pleased him. Catherine Parr debated him. But only Anne of Cleves understood him and knew when to walk away. She gave him grace when he expected rage. She gave him peace when he expected protest. She gave him friendship when he didn't deserve it. And when history came to collect its casualties, Anne simply stepped aside. That's why, in her quiet way, she became the most successful of all his wives. She didn't need to die for love or fight for legacy. She simply lived and kept living. Her story isn't loud, but it lingers. It's in the gardens she planted, the servants she rewarded, the nieces and nephews she wrote to. It's in the way even her enemies eventually softened when they spoke of her. And maybe that's why her tomb doesn't need marble grandeur, because what she left behind wasn't a monument, it was a lesson. Henry's world was about spectacle. Anne's was about survival. And survival, it turns out, lasts longer than spectacle every single time. If you ever visit Westminster Abbey, take a moment to find her. It's easy to miss, tucked behind more famous tombs, overlooked by the curious and the hurried. But when you stop there, when you stand in that cool, hushed chapel and trace the faint lettering of her name, you'll feel what history forgot to celebrate. The peace she built out of rejection, the grace she carried through humiliation, the quiet triumph of a woman who outlived the noise. She lies beside Mary, who forgave her, and Elizabeth, who admired her, the daughters of her enemy, now her silent companions in eternity. Together, they form a strange, perfect symmetry. Three women who survived the shadow of Henry VIII, resting side by side. There's no bitterness there, no echo of courtly cruelty, just peace. And maybe, if you listen hard enough, you can almost hear her soft, German-accented laugh, drifting through the centuries, amused at it all. Henry built his legacy in stone and blood. Anne built hers in silence and grace. And in the end, history will always need both, the noise to remember and the quiet to make sense of it. So rest well, Anne of Cleves, the woman who made peace her crown and patience her kingdom, the queen who won by walking away. So here we are, the end of Anne of Cleves' story. A story that began in a quiet German castle, passed through the chaos of Henry VIII's England, and ended in the calm of a garden filled with roses. It's tempting to call her life tragic, but that's not quite right. She didn't die young or in disgrace, or in some spectacular blaze of royal betrayal. Her tragedy wasn't in what she lost. It was in what she was never allowed to have. Anne was denied the things that should have been hers by right. Love, in a marriage where affection was replaced with politics. Belonging, in a court that never stopped reminding her she was foreign. And a voice, because for all her quiet dignity, history let louder people do the talking. But what she did have, she claimed fully. When the world tried to humiliate her, she turned it into an opportunity. When the king called her plain, she built a life so full of peace that it made his grandeur look cheap. And when everyone else was fighting to survive Henry's love, she thrived by walking away from it. Anne's life wasn't about failure. It was about endurance, the kind that doesn't make headlines, but still wins in the end. She was proof that grace can be a weapon, that silence can speak louder than outrage, and that survival, in its own way, is a kind of victory. So, as you drift off tonight, think of her, the woman who outlived them all, who built her happiness from scraps, who found power in patience, the woman who turned rejection into freedom and peace into legacy. You've made it all the way to the end, through betrayal, annulment, and 500 years of bad PR. If Anne of Cleves could survive Henry VIII, you can absolutely survive tomorrow morning. Good night, and if you haven't subscribed yet, remember, Anne forgives you. I don't. And if you did subscribe, well, that makes you part of the small, brave army keeping history alive, one quiet survivor at a time. You didn't just support the story, you supported the storyteller. And for that, from me, and probably Anne, thank you.